Boldwood presents The Library Girls of the East End, written by Patricia McBride and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. The New Job. England, summer 1940. Lady Carmichael looked at her daughter in dismay. "You're not serious. The East End of London? Why on earth would you want to work there? All sorts of unsavoury people live there. Poor people, immigrants, criminals, Jews." She frowned. "And where is this Silver Town? I've never heard of it. Is it the principal London centre for making jewellery?" "No, Mother. It's part of the East End, between Canning Town and the Thames." Her mother's eyes widened. "Really, Cordelia, that sounds just dreadful. I think you are making a massive mistake. An area like that will be full of people who'd never use a library. You'll be completely wasting your time. You could do far more good here in the village." Cordelia sighed as she gazed out of the window towards the sweeping drive. Her mother was a wonderful woman who did a great deal for charity, but she selected her projects carefully. She avoided actually meeting the poor and needy, as that wouldn't appeal to her at all. It was more her style to be in charge of a few chosen women in the village, telling them what to do to help the local underprivileged. Though her advice was often sound, Cordelia couldn't help but feel that her mother could be more compassionate towards the poor in the village. After all, they had lives and aspirations of their own. Yet, as lady of the manor, her mother's word was law, and her friends and people in the village rarely challenged her ideas. But now wasn't the time to remind her of all that. Cordelia had to choose her words delicately. Not that her mother could make her alter her mind about the job she'd just accepted. She'd long ago decided she wouldn't be her mother's carbon copy. Her mother enjoyed her life, but it would bore Cordelia to death. She could have found positions in several other libraries, but wanted to work somewhere where she could make a difference and help the local people. She was young to have a head librarian position, and knew it was because so many men were away at war. That and the fact that the library was relatively small. Nonetheless, she was determined to make a go of it. She'd visited Silvertown Library when she had her interview. She worried that the two women who would work for her, Jane and Mavis, wouldn't like the changes she planned. They were well established and used to doing things the way Mr. Bartlett, the previous manager, had dictated. She'd have to tread carefully and remember they had a wealth of knowledge she still had to learn. "Mummy, you do a lot. You've always got some charity event or other on the go." Her mother smoothed her already perfect ash-grey hair. "That's different, Cordelia, and you know it. People there have all sorts of terrible things. Fleas, TB, and goodness knows what. What if you catch something?" Jasper, Cordelia's brother, who'd been quietly sipping a whisky, butted in. "Mater, she's going to be in charge of a small library, not nursing consumptives in a sanatorium. Delia will share the flat in the West End with me. War or not, we'll have a high old time. That's the only good thing I can see. She can keep you in order and tame some of your more worrying ways. Goodness knows someone needs to. I have paid off your gambling debts for the last time, Jasper. Don't waste your time asking me again. It's time you took responsibility for your actions." Lady Carmichael sighed and twisted her wedding and engagement ring with its massive solitaire diamond. "I dread to think what your father would say if he found out, so don't ask him to help you. I've covered up for you until now, but no more. And why do you insist on calling Cordelia Delia? Cordelia is such a lovely name, and you're not children any more." Jasper stood and reached for his grey cashmere coat, admired himself in the gilt mirror over the fireplace, and blew his image a kiss. He was good-looking and knew it. His blonde hair and striking blue eyes had caught many a girl's attention. I've always called her Delia, mater, you know that. Somehow it suits a bookworm, although I like blue stocking better. Her mother ignored him and directed her comments at her daughter, shaking her head. It's bad enough that you went to that university, Cordelia. 3 years away from your family, and you never even got a degree. I don't know what to say to my friends about it when they ask to see the graduation photos. And in any case, you should look for a suitable husband now. After all, you are 23. You'll soon be too old to find a fitting match. You don't want to be left on the shelf. Cordelia swallowed her irritation and looked at her watch. You know the University of Cambridge doesn't give women degrees. Just tell your friends that. Perhaps you could start a campaign. As always happened when she spent time with her mother, Cordelia needed to escape from the stifling attitudes, however well meant. Anyway, I want to say hello to Cook before I get my train. I'll pack, then pop in to say goodbye before I leave. A maid, Stella, came in with a tea tray laden with tiny triangular ham sandwiches and cupcakes, as well as tea, milk, and sugar in silver pots. Will that be all, madam? Stella asked. Yes, thank you. You can go now. Her mother turned to her. Will you have some tea? But Cordelia's need to escape was greater than her need for a drink. No thanks, mother. I'll be off now. Her mother leaned over so Cordelia could kiss her cheek, and she then patted her arm absent-mindedly by way of dismissal. Oh, by the way, Cordelia, tomorrow I am leaving for Scotland for a week or 2. I expect you'll remember your great-aunt Bess from our holidays on the Isle of Skye when you were a child. You and Jasper had such fun running around the beach. She's had some bad news, so I am going to comfort her. She turned away and picked up the teapot, signalling it was time for Cordelia to leave. Glad to escape, Cordelia went upstairs to pack her case, wondering how she could be expected to keep Jasper in order. She was his big sister, but only by 2 years. Even as a child, she'd tried to stop him doing crazy things, rarely with success. There was that time he climbed a tree and couldn't get down. Worse, he stole from Cook's purse. Cordelia had raided her piggy bank to replace the money before Cook noticed. Then, when he was 16, she found him with gypsy girls in the woods by the river. She dragged him home and told their father what he'd been up to. Their father had beaten him and grounded him for a month. Jasper had sulked about the house the first week, calling her a traitor and saying he'd just been kissing the girls. The second week, he'd gone out every night and returned at dawn unabashed. He somehow charmed his way out of trouble every time. Despite his ability to get into mischief, they'd been close until about 2 years earlier, when he'd changed almost overnight. Heavy drinking, unsavoury companions and gambling now dominated his life. It was as if he was a different person. Her stomach twisted with worry, as it did whenever she thought about Jasper's errant ways. He'd almost become a stranger, and she missed their old, easy friendship. They used to bicker and fight, but it was all in good fun. Now they had little to say to each other. Her case packed and sighing at the memories of those good times, Cordelia went down to the kitchen. The cook's kind face lit up when she saw her, and wiping her hands on her pinny, she rushed over and wrapped her in a warm embrace. The heat from her familiar face was like the sun breaking through cloud, warming Cordelia's heart. Mrs. Taylor's red cheeks radiated her usual good health, and her eyes twinkled with liveliness. She smelt of cinnamon and baked biscuits. I'm sorry your visit's been so short, Cordelia. We've hardly had time to catch up. She turned to stir something on the stove. I heard you got that job in the library, not that your mother is at all pleased. Mrs. Taylor had been a lifelong confidant of Cordelia's, listening to her tales of troubles at school, fights with Jasper, and her exasperation at the role her parents expected her to play as a girl. Cook was always willing to listen without judgment and give sound advice if asked. Cordelia leaned over the table and snatched one of Mrs. Taylor's delicious rock cakes. She said, taking a bite. No one cooks as well as you. She sat down and wiped the crumbs from her top. After the interview, I went to see your brother, Derek, like you suggested. Did you know he's moved? She reached into her pocket, took out a piece of paper and handed it to her. This is his new address. It's only a couple of doors along. Mrs. Taylor frowned. Why on earth did he move? He's been there for ages. It's a sad story. He's friendly with a Jewish man he's known for a year, a barber who cuts his hair. When this friend called to see your brother, the landlord saw him and threw your brother out. You mean he's a Jew hater? A black shirt? Cook's face had gone pale. Cordelia nodded. He must be. There's a fair bit of unrest around there. You'd think people would be more sympathetic. After all, a lot of the Jewish immigrants have come because of what that awful man Hitler is doing to them. Mrs. Taylor shook her head. It's shameful, that's what it is. I'll never understand people like that as long as I live. She folded up the tea towel she'd been using. How did you get on with my Derek? Cordelia remembered the tiny front room he had shown her into. It was obviously only used for visitors and special occasions. Very well. He's a lovely man, and he says he'll volunteer in the library. He only works part-time now, so he'll be able to fit it in. But the poverty in that area is just unbelievable. I was shocked when I looked around. Do you know some people still don't have electricity? In 1940? You'd think we were still in Victorian times. Mrs. Taylor put the kettle on. A lot of the people live in dreadful rented property with no running water, a shared kitchen with a whole tenement, and don't get me started about the toilets. But knowing you, you'll find a way to help. I've heard the government is building new council houses out of London. Maybe Derek will get one. She stopped when someone tapped at the back door. It's only me, Mrs. T, my angel, my sunshine, an elderly man in a brown cotton coat said, putting his head round the door. Come to deliver this week's meat order to my favourite customer. Mrs. Taylor nodded and handed him a paper bag containing 2 rock cakes. Here, I've got these ready for you. You're always hungry. Put the meat in the cauldron, please. When he'd gone, she turned back to Cordelia. If you hadn't been here, he'd have proposed again. She grinned. He does it every time. Like I'd want to get married again. No, thank you. I'm not washing an old man's socks and pants. He even got down on one knee once. You could have heard his knees cracking from the end of the garden. She chuckled. Still, I suppose it's good for me ego. Anyway, I hope you've got time for a cuppa before you go. Cordelia nodded, and Mrs. Taylor continued to chat. One thing you need to know about the people in the East End. A lot of them had to leave school real early to bring in money for the family or look after their younger brothers and sisters. Some of them can't even read and write properly. But they're just as smart as you and that brother of yours, just never had the chance to use their brains in a way that gives them a step up in life. Cordelia reached for another rock cake, but Mrs. Taylor slapped her hand. You wait for the tea, young lady, she said, reaching for the brown teapot with its knitted red, white and blue wool cosy. As they waited for the tea to brew, Cordelia leaned over and squeezed Mrs. Taylor's hand affectionately. I don't know what I'd have done without you when I was a child, she said. Coming in here to see you was always my safe place, where I was allowed to be myself. Mrs. Taylor poured the tea. Seems to me, and I may be speaking out of turn, that posh people, moneyed people, worry about keeping up appearances much more than the rest of us. And goodness knows that's not saying much. Still, you've ploughed your own furrow in the end, and I can see it's making you happy. That's the main thing. Still, the right man comes along, and you might think again. Are you over that bloke you almost got engaged to? I remember it broke your heart. Cordelia grimaced. I think my heart is well and truly mended, but it'll be a long time before I trust anyone else with it, so don't get your best wedding guest outfit ready yet, she said. I'm in no hurry. I promise if the right man comes along, you'll be the first to know, but it won't be any time soon. I'd better get going or I'll miss my train." She hugged Mrs. Taylor again. "Now for my exciting challenge. See you next time I'm home." Chapter 2. Family Trouble. The 10th of July, 1940. Mavis grimaced as she left home on her way to work. Old Kempson, the rent collector, was knocking on her neighbour's door hard enough to break it down. "I know you're in there," he shouted, his bowler hat almost falling to the ground. "Come on, time to pay up." Mavis tapped him on the shoulder. "No good knocking there. Mary's just had another nipper. She ain't got no money for the rent." Kempson glared at her. "Nipper or no nipper, she has to pay her rent, same as everyone else." His jacket was shiny with wear, and his shoes were so old the soles were probably padded with cardboard. Mavis often wondered if he managed to pay his own rent. The miserable git of a landlord obviously didn't pay him much. Not that it made her feel sorry for him. "Leave her alone. She can't pay the blooming rent, and that's that." His shoulders sagged. "OK, but she'll have to pay double next week." Mavis took a step towards him, swinging her large handbag, and he took a nervous step back. "If she ain't got the rent this week, she ain't going to have double next week, is she, you stupid man?" She reached into her purse and handed him £0.50. "Here, take that off her bill. Maybe she can pay a bit more next week." He put the coin in his leather satchel and strode on to the next house without another word. Closing her bag, Mavis glanced at Mary's window. The edge of the snowy white net curtains moved a couple of inches, and Mary's pale, exhausted face appeared. She smiled her thanks. Mavis winked at her and hurried towards the library. No bus today. She'd have to walk now she'd given that £0.50 to the rent man, and she'd have to live on bread and dripping for a couple of days. It wouldn't be the first time. As she walked on, she passed old Mrs. Hoffman on the corner, selling her little round doughnuts straight from the pan. The woman's smiley, plump face was framed by a grey felt hat she'd worn for years. She was bending over the steaming vat of oil as she slid a fresh batch of dough into the bubbling fat. A strong smell of cinnamon and sugar rose from the pan, making Mavis's stomach rumble. She often bought one on her way to work, but she'd have to wait a few days. They were only a halfpenny, but she couldn't spare it. "Shabbat shalom," she called with a wave. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but had heard her Jewish neighbours greet each other with the words often. Mrs. Hoffman held out her big, "I saw what you did. Have this one on the house." She put a doughnut in a square of newspaper and pressed it into Mavis's hand. Mavis took it gratefully, biting into it and closing her eyes with pleasure as she savoured the sweet treat. Mavis looked at her watch and walked more quickly. Wouldn't do to be late on the first day with the new boss. She didn't like change, and old Mr. Bartlett had suited her just fine. He was her idea of a perfect library manager, with his stiff back, black suit, bowler hat and precise way of speaking. Pernickety and quick to find fault, but you always knew where you were with him. Every day the same. Life in her neighbourhood offered more than enough excitement, thank you very much. She'd never admit it, but this new one, Miss Carmichael, made her feel inferior with her fancy clothes and way of speaking, like she was royalty or something. She was in for a shock when she got to know what was what. Mavis went across the road and was almost pushed aside by a lad in a black cap with a bucket and shovel running to collect droppings from the coalman's horse that had just passed by. Yes, Miss C, as Mavis already thought of her, would need a peg on her nose when old Bert came in to read the newspapers, stinking to high heaven. Then there was the old Jewish man, beard halfway down his chest. He sat there every day, scratching away on a notepad. She called him the Professor, but she had no idea what his background was. His accent was so thick, she had trouble understanding anything he said. Her thoughts returned to Ken, her son, who was on leave and eating her out of house and home. She sighed with relief, remembering he was due back in barracks the next day. She rubbed her forearm, where the sleeve of her jumper concealed a deep bruise he'd given her the night before, when she'd refused to give him all her money. He'd searched high and low in their 3 rooms, upturning furniture and making it look like burglars had ransacked the place. But she was smarter than him, and the money she'd scrimped and saved was safe and well hidden. For now. Although the bruise on her arm was covered, she still felt its immediate ache, could hear the slap of his hand as he struck her. She remembered the sickly sweet smell of the alcohol on his breath. Ken wasn't especially tall or well built, but he was strong, nevertheless, and had a vein-pounding temper. His face had been a vision of frustration and anger as he hit her, wanting his own way as usual. If he hadn't been her son, she'd have reported him to the police. Not that they'd have done anything. As far as they were concerned, violence within 4... "I know you've got money somewhere, you bitch," he'd hissed, his nostrils flaring as he swept her precious little ornament of a girl onto the floor. It smashed into a dozen pieces. It was a cheap fairing, a little painted shepherdess, but she was fond of it because it reminded her of happier days, when she went to the fair with her friends. She'd won it by getting hoops over a piece of wood. They'd all jumped up and down with excitement as if she'd won the football pools. Now it was beyond repair. Shoving her aside so hard she'd have fallen to the floor if a chair hadn't been in the way, Ken had stormed out of the front door, slamming it so hard it rattled. She turned the kitchen chair the right way up and collapsed onto it, breathless, her heart beating fast. At last, he seemed to have forgotten about wanting to know about his dad, thank goodness. Mavis was still up when Ken arrived home. He didn't even notice her as he pushed his way out of the back door to the outside lavvy. Then, trousers still half undone, collapsed on his bed. So when she got up, the first day with the new boss ahead, she had tiptoed around, making herself some tea and toast as quietly as she could. Even though Ken was leaving, she didn't want to wake him. Experience told her he was unbearable when he had a hangover and would look for a fight over the smallest thing. She quietly tidied the kitchen. She'd leave the front doorstep unscrubbed for once in case she woke him, although she knew that would be noted by some of the nastier women in the street. They thought anyone who didn't scrub their step first thing was a filthy slut. She sighed. So be it. With her coat on, she put a cup of tea on the floor near the bed, shook Ken's shoulder, and rushed out of the house before he properly came to. It began to rain. Not heavily, but enough to soak her. She pulled her hat lower on her head and put up her umbrella. Immediately, the traffic sounded different, louder. Now petrol was rationed, there were more horses and carts on the streets, more people using bicycles, or like her, buses. She hurried past factories, market stalls, butchers, bakers, and all the other places that were the heart of the East End, greeting 6 people as she usually did. She loved it all. The sounds of the barrow boys calling out their wares, the smells of cooking from 12 different nationalities, the variety of languages, and the day-to-day challenges of living in a poor, crowded area. She hoped never to move. The lack of air attacks so far, following the end of what the newspapers called the phony war, gave her hope that her home was safe. And she hurried faster. She'd just make it. Chapter 3. A Harsh Mother. "I don't know why you want to work in that stupid library, my girl," Jane's mother said, as she took her hands out of the washing tub and wiped little Helen's nose. "Why can't you work on the sewing machines like all the other girls round here? We've always been in the rag trade in our family. You'd never be out of work." Jane hugged her little girl, breathing in her girlish scent, stroking her smooth young skin and hating having to leave her. Leave her with the woman whose harsh mothering she'd experienced all her life. "I'll see you later, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing her again. Putting on her coat, she turned to her mother. "The library is a good job, Mum, and people will always want books." She grabbed her bag and tried to leave the house as quickly as possible. She couldn't bear the look on her mother's face, disapproving and disparaging. It was a horribly familiar expression. Her mother snorted. "Huh, shows what you know. Us EastEnders don't have time for book reading. Oh, no." Jane edged closer towards the door, knowing her mother was going to start one of her rants. "Oh, no, we spend all our time just keeping the house clean and trying to find enough money for the rent and food." Gritting her teeth, Jane leaned forward and kissed her mother on the cheek. "There's a new boss starting today, Mum. Miss Carmichael." Her mother's jaw dropped. "A woman? In charge of the library? Are they mad? That's a man's job, or my name's not Hilda Richards." Jane opened the front door, letting in cold air, noxious from all the factories in the tight-knit streets. "I'll see you both later," she said, and stepped outside. The air might be tainted, but at least she was away from her mother's vicious tongue. "Hello, Bobbala," called Mrs. Cohen from next door. "I heard your mum going on at you again. Wasn't earwigging on purpose, mind. I reckon the walls between your house and mine are only held up with wallpaper." "It'd be easier arguing with a lump of rock," Jane replied with a shrug. "Still, she has her good points. Remind me what they are, if you spot them." "Any word from your man yet?" Mrs. Cohen asked. "Terrible him being called up and that, when we'd hardly known there was a war on. Could have been here, helping you bring up your little un." Jane's heart tightened at the thought of her husband. When they married, they were thrilled to get a home, even if it was only 2 rooms. Their few months together had been everything she'd dreamed of, even helping around the place sometimes. They'd had precious little money, but enjoyed the occasional visit to the pictures or a walk by the Thames. Each time she looked into his lovely blue eyes or felt his strong arms around her, she felt safe and loved. Feelings she'd never had at home with her mother. But the war put paid to their contented life all too soon. When George was called up, she'd had to move in with her mum to manage. Every night she prayed he would be safe and there would be a way out of her situation. She took off her wedding ring and put it in her purse. Married women weren't allowed to work in the library. It was a secret she fought hard to keep. They allowed widows like Mavis, though, something that seemed illogical to Jane. Waving goodbye to her kind neighbour, Jane hurried up the street towards the bus stop. She hadn't gone more than a few yards before cheeky Wally Walker from number 37 ran past her, shouting to his mate to wait for him. But he wasn't looking where he was going, tripped over his own feet and went flying. "Wally!" Jane called, bending over to help him up. Not that he wanted help, not from a girl. "Let me look," she said, getting out her hanky and wiping his grazed knee. "It's not too bad. Go home and give it a wash or it might go septic." He brushed away her hand and ran off. She grinned, knowing he had no intention of following her advice. She stood at the bus stop, aware that the girls working in the clothing sweatshops would already have been at work for more than half an hour. She could hear the machines humming away from where she stood. Most of her school friends went into the rag trade at 14. There'd been hell to pay when she told her ma she wanted to stay on. "Stay on? Stay on? Oh, no, you won't, my girl. I've set you up to see Mr. Jones at Barton's Fabrics. You'll start on Monday." Trembling, Jane had stood her ground, yet didn't quite dare look her mother in the eyes. "No, I'm not going there. Mrs. Smith says I'm bright and can do better than factory work." Her mother looked as if she'd have a stroke, her eyes bulging and her breath fast and heavy. "You'll do as I say, or leave this house and don't bother coming back." With that, she slammed down the iron she was holding and turned away. Jane had waited for her to say more, but her back rigid, her mother carried on with the ironing. Fighting back tears, Jane had gone upstairs and put her few belongings into 2 old pillowcases. She didn't tell her mum that Mrs. Smith had offered her a tiny box room and food in return for babysitting and housework when she wasn't at school. Her heart heavy, "I'll let you know where I am, Mum." She got no reply. She walked to Mrs. Smith's that day, feeling a sense of relief as she approached the cosy house. It was the only place where she felt truly welcomed. The warm summer breeze flowed through her hair as she knocked on the front door. The house wasn't much bigger than her mum's, but Mrs. Smith had it all to herself and didn't have to share the outside lavvy. Jane stayed on at school for another 2 years and passed her school certificate. She'd always be grateful to that kind teacher who saw something in her that her mother never saw. She'd put a note through her mum's door telling her the good news about passing her exams. They hadn't spoken in all that time, but her mum sent a note back congratulating her, and that was the beginning of them talking again. Not that their conversations were easy, even then. Still, why couldn't her mother be pleased she'd done well at school and got a decent job? She didn't earn much, but it was more than factory work. Once she moved back in with her mum, when George went to war, she handed over most of her wages each week. It was never enough to satisfy her mother, though. She sighed and wondered if she should take the chance to evacuate to the country with her little girl. But then she'd have to give up her good job, and, despite what her mother might say, she'd struggle without her. As she sat on the bus, she looked out at the familiar run-down houses. Most of them had 2 or more families living in them. Some of the tenements were in a dreadful state, crumbling, unsanitary and full of vermin. Her mum's house was full. They had 3 rooms and a young couple lived in the small attic rooms. They shared an outside lavvy with 3 other houses. The smell was something rotten, especially in the summer. 2 women came and sat behind her. "Look at all this stuff they've done," one said, looking out of the window. "White lampposts and things. And don't talk to me about the blackouts. I'm sick of them little ARP Hitlers always telling me off." The other one joined in. "Still, if this war ever does get properly started, I suppose we'll be changing our tune and grateful. Hope it never does, though. Mind you, if bombs don't get us, the blackout will. My neighbour walked into a lamppost a couple of nights ago and knocked himself out." Jane dragged her thoughts away from the women and shook herself out of her gloomy mood. This Miss Carmichael, her new boss, must have known what she was coming to, and despite being taken aback by her voice and expensive clothes when she met her after her interview, Jane thought she seemed nice and friendly, and shook her hand as if she was an equal. "I'm looking forward to working with you." Jane started at that. Old Mr. Bartlett never thought he worked with her. She worked for him, as far as he was concerned. If he saw her outside work, he barely acknowledged it. Sometimes she wondered if he even recognised her. Nothing had changed in the library for years and years, and Jane hoped Miss Carmichael would bring it up to date. Not that her co-worker would agree. Mavis liked things to stay as they were. Jane was fond of her. They were good friends, but she was a little cautious of Mavis's sharp tongue. "We've got enough to deal with, what with another war. Be careful what you wish for," she'd said, when Jane told her how nice the library in Boots the chemist was. "Library," the conductor shouted, bringing her back to the moment. She stepped off the bus, wondering what the day would bring. Chapter 4. A New Start. Cordelia stood outside the library, which was much grander than anything nearby. It stood on the junction of 2 roads and was 2 stories high, with a large cupola on top. She knew it also had a basement, although she hadn't been shown inside. She took a deep breath, wondering what the future would bring for her here. Her stomach rolled as she considered what she'd taken on. Her friends, who'd also trained as librarians, thought she'd lost her mind taking on such an enormous challenge. Silvertown Library couldn't be more different from the library at Girton College, Cambridge. There, everything was revered. Books were treated with respect. Girls walked quietly to avoid disturbing others. Learning was paramount. All was hushed and learned. But everything around her on the junction of Barking Road and Silvertown Road was noisy business. Cars, trams, horse and carts, and hundreds of people hurrying to get to wherever they were going. The air was full of so many smells, it was hard to distinguish them all. Smoke from the chimneys, horse dung, cooking factory fumes, and others Cordelia couldn't identify. Moving the bundle of newspapers she'd bought on her way over, she reached for the key the interviewers had given her when she accepted the job, and mounted the 2 steps to the double front door. To her surprise, it was already unlocked. Worried that anyone could have wandered in, Cordelia stepped into the library cautiously. The bundle of newspapers clumsily shifted in her arms, the pages rustling in the sudden stillness. She felt a chill of apprehension. "Is anyone there?" she called out softly. The silence that followed seemed to echo in the air. Cordelia held her breath as she listened for any sign of life, but the only sound she heard was the slight creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. She took a deep breath and decided to explore further. As she wandered down the aisles of books, she couldn't shake off the feeling that someone or something was watching her. She felt a strange presence in the air, a feeling she couldn't put her finger on. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from the back room. A loud thud as if something was being thrown or dropped. Cordelia jumped and her heart began to race. Her grip on the newspapers tightened. Then she heard footsteps, clipping importantly along from deeper inside the building. The sound was marked by a slight echo, bouncing off the library's walls, amplifying its significance. And there, dressed in a brown tweed suit and a hat with a bird feather, was Mrs. Montague Smythe, a local councillor. "Oh, there you are," she said, frowning. "I thought you were never coming. I was inspecting the place while I waited." Cordelia's heart sank. But she had already decided to start as she meant to go on with this counsellor. She got the measure of her at her interview. "I'm an hour early, Mrs. Montague Smythe," she smiled sweetly. "Perhaps your watch is wrong." Mrs. Montague Smythe grunted. "Well, at least you're here now. You'd better come through so I can show you around." Cordelia followed her to the main lending room. "That's very kind of you, but the temporary manager already showed me around last week, and he left me detailed instructions on how to run the library. He was very thorough." Seemingly at a loss for how to assert her authority, Mrs. Montague Smythe rubbed her fingers along one of the library shelves. "Dust!" she exclaimed. "You'll need to have a word with the cleaner. We must uphold standards, you know. Public libraries are a breeding ground for germs. We don't want to be responsible for our readers getting polio, or worse." "I understand that Janet, the cleaner, was poorly last week, but she's due back today." With the amount of traffic and dust coming through the doors, Cordelia secretly thought it would take an army of cleaners to keep the place pristine. They were interrupted by the back door opening as both Mavis and Jane came in. When they saw Mrs. Montague Smythe and Cordelia, they hesitated, unsure of what they should do. Cordelia took a step forward. "Do come in, and I see you're nice and early. You know Mrs. Montague Smythe, I think? She was very kindly welcoming me on my first morning." Cordelia turned to the counsellor. "I very much appreciate your kind thought, especially when you're such a busy person. I've already heard all about your good works for the area." Mrs. Montague Smythe, wrong-footed again, could think of nothing to say, her mouth flapping emptily. "Well, I—" Cordelia turned and stepped towards the door. "You must be very busy, so I won't keep you any longer. We need to get ready to open up for the day." The counsellor, mesmerised, began to walk towards the door, then stopped. She turned to Mavis and Jane. "I expect you two to show your new manager here the ropes. She has a lot to learn." The three of them silently watched her as she continued to walk towards the front door. The skirt of her suit was a bit tight across her backside. Cordelia noticed. It seemed that her new colleague also spotted this. "Two ferrets in a sack," Mavis muttered, looking at the retreating rear. Cordelia pretended not to have heard and struggled to look serious. She tried to be professional and keep a straight face. She really did, but a chortle exploded from her lips like a cork from a bottle. They all laughed so much they were doubled over. Luckily, Mrs. Montague Smythe had just left and was out of earshot. "Oh, OK," Cordelia said after she'd wiped her eyes. "Who usually opens up?" "Mr. Bartlett. Well, he did," Jane said apologetically. "But since he died, God rest his soul, we've had a variety of different managers." "Yeah, and every single one thought the library should be run in a different way. Enough to drive you nuts." Mavis raised her eyes to the sky as she spoke. "Right, well, I'll carry on Mr. Bartlett's way and open the doors, except when it's my day off, of course." Cordelia headed towards the door, wondering what all the noise outside was. She soon found out when she opened it. 3 tramps almost pushed her against the wall, rushing in from the wind. The smell of one of them, she couldn't tell which, trailed behind him like ghostly ectoplasm. She followed them into the main lending room. None looked for a book or returned one. 2 of the men sat on the floor, leaned against a wall and promptly fell asleep. The other went to a rectangular table. "It's a far cry from Boots the Chemist library," she thought. Subscription only meant patrons were comfortably off. Being mostly middle-aged or older women, they could browse the books and sit in comfortable armchairs for as long as they liked. The ones who paid for their every need catered for, as Cordelia witnessed every time she went there. "Do you have any books you'd like us to get for your next visit, Lady Cordelia?" the girl would ask. They kept a list of all the higher-paying patrons, along with books they'd read and ones they might like. A shout wrestled her attention from these comforting memories. "Where's the papers? There's always papers here first thing," the man at the table shouted. "What sort of a library is this? No papers?" Jane quickly picked up the batch of papers Cordelia had put on the counter and ran over to him. "Here you are, Bert. We're a bit behind today, I'm afraid. New boss, Miss Carmichael." Cordelia was close behind her and apologised for the delay in getting the papers out. Bert merely grunted. There was no time to dawdle. The door opened again and in walked a mother with 2 children, one in a pram that had seen better...